Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mind Your Mission. I am really excited for today's episode because I have my dad on the podcast today for a little Father's Day special. And other than I'd say the Bible, probably, the wisdom that my dad has imparted into my life has been the most powerful and impactful. So I am really excited for you guys to get a taste of that today. My dad, primarily, he always says that he's been stuck in the 8th grade for 30 years because he is a middle school teacher and has been for a very long time. So that's his day job, but in the in-between, he does so many other things in the community and has raised us to also be involved in our communities and has taught me a lot about minding my mission as an American citizen. So that is specifically what we're going to focus on today. We'll touch on a few different topics, but primarily we wanted to, as a teacher and a military officer, just kind of talk about why it's important for us to be informed citizens, or why we should even care about what's going on in our world and our country today. So I'm really excited to dive in. And Dad, I'll just have you start by sharing a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey, well, I guess I think you've already described it. I'm your dad. Maybe I'll stick with that title. Maybe we can start out with just dad, right? I know grandpa. I know the grandpa title is available. I
Yep.
haven't really spent much time working on that yet. I'm still trying to perfect the dad thing, right? Obviously, I've done a lot of other things, but I think as you kind of scripted out what you wanted to talk about today, I think the life experiences that come from raising kids successfully today, I think they eventually, that job of a dad ultimately teaches you how to be an effective adult. And so the older I get, the more that I realize that that particular role is probably what my priority is. And just providing those services to you and your sister, and then as a teacher and a coach, and the other things I've done, obviously I've had to take care of a lot of other people along the way. So
Yeah, I was talking to Anne earlier, and we did an episode with Anne, so people have heard her story a bit, but I was just talking to her about the quotes, the one-liners that we have from you, and one of them that came up was that having kids teaches you how to be an adult, because that has been very true in my year and a half of parenting now, and I've learned a lot from it in so many different areas that I didn't expect to. So, yeah, so let's dive in. First, like you mentioned, you've been a coach, teacher, a parent, you've been involved with like county search and rescue, so many different things. And I would love to know, what do you think it means to mind your mission as an American citizen?
yeah, that's a really big question, right? I mean, mind your mission. I guess if we jump over to my day job, right, as a middle school teacher of over 30 years, and you're right, I've been stuck in the 8th grade for a long time. That's a lot. There's a reason everybody, right, does 8th grade once and not over and over. At this point in my career, I tell my kids that I'm a recovering technology teacher. So for 25 years, I was fortunate to really, embrace the internet. That was that era where, I dug computers out of the corner of a classroom of a retiring teacher, plugged it into the wall, and voila, we turned on the internet. And then in the last 6 years, I had the opportunity to switch over to a history civics teacher role. And I did that deliberately, just because I was starting to become concerned of all the screen time kids were doing. And so, the last 6 years trying to get these kids off the screens and back into paper pencil, and to become civic minded. So I'm sure you'll kind of expand that question of minding your mission. But as far as my professional career right now, it's really looking at the 13 and 14-year-old kid, especially coming out of COVID, which was a real unique experience in itself. I know you were here and watched some of that, as the four of us kind of hunkered down and literally got things back up and running. Across country, us for school district and for her work, and mom for her work as well, and had a lot of education going on. So just really, and that's when I had just started teaching the civics, right? The history and the civics. So I think COVID really influenced, I think, where I am today, still trying to put kids back together and recover from that.
Yeah, it's so interesting just hearing both you and mom talk about teaching, because since you've been doing it for 30 years, you've seen that transition from no screens to screens. And everything that goes along with that. And you've also seen just society change. Behavior of kids changes, standards of how kids should act changes, all those things changes. And it's interesting when I think about technology to civics because people might be like, well, those are two separate things. But in my mind, watching you transition, it was seamless and it seemed very necessary and right because what was needed at the time with technology, the need shifted to going back to the basics that so many kids don't have these days. So just generally, why is it important for your eighth graders, for high school students, for college students? Why is it important for them and for us to stay informed about what's going on in the world? And how does being informed help us live out our day-to-day life?
So I think there's two things here, and I would start by saying that, like literally, kids have been turned into a product, and so what has happened with, especially social media, this being social media, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're using this as a tool to get information out to kids, but the marketing needs kids clicking and scrolling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tell the kids, you're either going to use technology as a tool or as a toy, and you have to use it. It's not like it's an option to run away from it,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't disconnect either, but you have to become better informed. And so as I've helped these kids understand what that really means, from a media point of view, I think that's really allowed me to develop my focus on where I'm going with them. So the two parts that I was going to go into was part number one is just that marketing. They've been turned into a product, that part of it. But on the other hand of it, the history and the civics behind it. I'm sure that you'll branch into like the religious aspect that you referenced in the opening, because I approach religion, but I have to. When I'm
Mm-hmm.
working with the public from a historical point of view, that's based on laws, separation of church and state. But for these kids, as I started teaching the history, right? You need your history. You need to be civic minded. Now we've got this powerful technology, especially with AI, that's really changing things. How are these kids going to approach that? And so that's really the two parts, is the technology part, but there's also the history, civics minded part. But then where you're asking me to come in and speak to your audience, obviously a younger audience than me,
Mm-hmm.
it became impossible to teach the history or to prepare kids where they were going, if they didn't at least have the history of Christianity when it comes to Constitution,
Yeah.
because that sets the moral foundation that people are going to agree on a set of rules. There's
Mm-hmm.
some basic things that you're going to do. You're not going to harm people.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to steal. And so I've had to figure out how to bring that back into the classroom in such a way that, party politics aside, you're going to have, for me, I'm going to have people looking at it from many lenses. My administrators are going to look at it. You're going to have a 13-year-old that goes home and interprets what I said, may or may not be what I said. And then you're going to have the politics of that. But yet, getting back to that civic minded student, and I can say at this point, after 5 years, I'm not necessarily getting those phone calls, or my administrator's not fielding those phone calls for me. We now have kids that are realizing, wow, I need to look at this from a bigger perspective than the mainstream media politics. There's a story here, and they're starting to understand that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because when I think about myself, obviously I had you as a dad. I had mom who's also very informed about politics and history and everything. But I don't think that I took a personal interest. I mean, it's come in phases. I remember watching the history series with you during COVID, so that was an initial interest in history because even though I was taught it in school, I didn't retain it well in school. And then the second wave of wanting to be informed came really this last year, and I think it's twofold. One, just there's a lot of things going on in our country that make you want to be informed, but also being a parent puts a new perspective on why it matters. And that goes right back to the fact that having kids teaches you to be an adult because your perspective grows and it becomes about more than just you. And when the things that are happening affect your kids, it kind of like sparks a little fire under your butt and says, okay, like maybe you should care about this. So I think it's interesting because when I think back to my eighth grade self, which is all the kids that you're teaching, or where even my sister Ann is today, like I, how do you to your students frame the importance of it? How do you get them interested?
Well, I think you've got to be age appropriate, right? You don't want 13-year-olds to be burdened by adult politics,
Hmm.
but at the same time, you have to be speaking to them in their world and preparing them for the world that they're going into.
Hmm.
But I guess the perspective that I have, just because, I've coached high school baseball in the first half of my career, I coached high school softball in the second half of my career. So I'm dealing, with young adults. So I have over, what is it, 32 years now of
Hmm.
watching kids graduate from high school. Well, after those 32 years, I've got close friends that are in their 40s. Once kids get out of school, you run across them, and then eventually, in your adult life, think about it, right? So I have kids that are now in their
Hmm.
mid 40s, and I'm in my
Yeah,
mid
crazy.
50s now, right? And so you really have to think about them going into the adult world. And when you run into those kids after 30 years in a small town, it's going to be when you have pneumonia at 2 o'clock in the morning and you can't breathe, and somebody comes up to your bed in the ER, and
Hmm.
you're trying to get your next breath, and somebody comes up and says, "Hey, Mr. Edwards," and you're like, "Oh wow, I hope I treated this 13-year-old 20 years ago with respect, because now they're a nurse." And then they wheel you into the CT scan, and kid comes up and it says, "Hey, Coach Edwards, what's going on?" And you're just like, "Oh man, I hope I didn't cut this kid, or I hope I gave him enough innings," right?
Hmm.
And so over time, I think as a senior, a veteran, an old guy that's been around the classroom a while, you start seeing these 13-year-olds of what they can be someday,
Hmm.
and they pick up on that when you start showing that respect to them. And then obviously you get those grocery store conversations over the holidays when they come back into town, and you start seeing their kids. I think that's where I've gained that perspective on how to meet them where they are, but yet having a 30 plus year of reflection of knowing where they're going to go.
Hmm.
You obviously went into the military. I'll never forget a young man who he had his own challenges, kind of a little guy when he was in the eighth grade, and survived eighth grade, which is hard on anybody, right? But the day he walked in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat and had to duck to get through my doors, and he was working on a naval submarine, right? So
Hmm.
you never know where these kids are going to go.
Yeah. So you've taught history, technology, and now civics for years. I mean, I feel like even when you were teaching technology, the history and civics were woven in there. And I remember vividly one unit, like where we have to write our resume. And like that seems like a basic task, but if it's not taught, it's not learned, which is another thing that you always say. um, and so with these things, how can understanding them help us to avoid making mistakes and guide us towards staying on track as citizens?
I think there's the cliche, conversation about, we learn from history, and we learn from our mistakes, which is true. I mean, there's value, right? There's some things we don't want to go back and do a second time, and with an adult brain, you can start to see, that bigger story. But really, I think more importantly is the message that you're going to make mistakes.
Hmm.
And sometimes in our, perfect, everybody gets a trophy world that we've created, we forget that learning is messy. We forget that life is messy.
Yeah.
And what's most important is not that you don't make mistakes, but that you're able to recover and learn from your mistakes. And then, you're kind of wanting my old guy perspective, speaking to a younger audience, to come out. And at some point, I think we need mentors, and people that you can trust, that you've got this. In my life, I had the greatest generation. If we were to get into generational conversations, as the greatest generation started to pass away, and like, so my high school boss, right, who ran a hotel, built that hotel from the ground up when he met his wife when his naval ships were in Port
Hmm.
Angeles. he became a significant man in my life. But this is a guy that was literally, his battleship was pulling into Pearl Harbor when his buddies were getting blown up on the boats that were already in there. He obviously survived. And it wasn't until, I was 16 in the Pensacola Museum and he's showing me pictures of his boat and explaining Pearl Harbor to me, right? Wasn't a guy that talked politics a lot or a guy that necessarily shared his war stories. But in that unique moment, I realized, holy cow, this is the greatest generation. Well, as that greatest generation started to pass away and the baby boomers took their place, and it took me a while to catch on to what was going on.
Hmm.
But I always thought when I saw old people that they were that greatest generation. Remember, the
Yeah.
women went to work. I have my history. I can teach history here. The women went to work in the factories, and the world changed. But everybody was on the same page. I would say now the generations we have are much more divided, and there isn't that common expectation, that common role that people play.
Yeah.
Some people could say that that's good because it doesn't stereotype people. But I
Hmm.
think your culture needs a sense of unity. I think it
Hmm.
needs a sense of history. That's why empires come and go. They evolve through, there's probably 5 or 7 distinct stages that they go through. Even though
Hmm.
we're a young country, um, we're in some of those later stages that's given us some challenges. But at some point, we have to go back to our roots and realize all of us have a role, and we need to function collectively. And so, specifically, kids, or even, you're a kid to me, obviously, but
Hmm.
you're becoming a young adult and you're raising another generation. You've always had a unique um, awareness to that. But that's because, when you were 6 years old, you were either being drug up and down the I-5 corridor in, delivery trucks because we were running state gymnastics meets out of our state's, facilities. At that point, it was the Tacoma Dome, or whether you were on a bus with me because I was coaching. I think you're going to talk about Ann's cancer. That was a
Hmm.
unique experience for you. But not only does all those experiences give you perspective,
Hmm.
but those experiences, like I'm dealing with the situation that started unfolding Friday at school. Obviously, I can't go into confidential
Hmm.
details, but as I was talking to the mom today or emailing with the mom, kind of have an idea what she's going through just because of my experiences. You don't come out and
Yeah.
say, "Hey, I know everything you're going through," but it just gives you a little bit of a head start to try to say the right things and not say the wrong things, and help just be a guide on the side so people can again learn from their own experience, their own history, and some of them are going to be hard experiences.
Hmm. Yeah. This summer, mom had shared with me the cycle that hard times make strong men make good times make weak men, and weak men make hard times. Just that cycle. And it's been so fascinating to just look through history with that cyclical lens because it is very true. And the adjectives weak and strong and hard and good, it looks different throughout history what the definition of hard times is, because hard times today looks very different than hard times before we had electricity, for example. Um, but yeah, it's interesting looking at it with that lens. And then also when it comes to hard times, and you touched on this, but Liz and I, the episode before this one, we were talking through advice that we'd have for people that are just graduating, since it's graduation season and people are headed off to college or graduating college. And so we were just talking through advice. And one thing I was reflecting on is that like there were a lot of hard times, high school, college, and I made a lot of choices that I wish I wouldn't have made, sure. But also those hard times and those choices that I made were the choices that made me. And they built my character. So that actually, we'll just slide right into the character conversation because that's something that you have always, both as your daughter, as your student, and as an athlete of yours, you've always emphasized character in whatever we're doing, whether it's leaving the bus better than we found it, or if it's showing character by shaking the umpire's hand at the end of a game. You've always made that the priority versus whatever we were doing, whether it be playing softball. Like it was never about winning. It was just about building our character. And so why is character so crucial for fulfilling our mission in life?
Well, I mean, if you look at the biological necessity of failure, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you put your hand on the burner and it hurts, then your
Mm-hmm.
brain is going to remember, don't put your hand on the burner. If you put your hand on the burner and the burner's off and nothing happens, you're not going to remember anything. Your brain is not going to use up, cells, right,
Mm-hmm.
to remember or record stuff that isn't relevant to your biological survival, right? And so once you start understanding, the fundamentals behind that, then you start realizing, wait a second, when things go wrong and things fail, that's an opportunity for me to actually learn and grow. I'm going to retain that knowledge, right? And so, not that you want to engineer pain in your life, but what starts to happen as you get older, you start realizing that when things go wrong and you do experience pain, and that's where the faith comes in. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there's going to be a lesson here. I have to sometimes kick it in neutral. Sometimes you have to downshift and put it into first gear and grind away. Sometimes you just keep your foot on the throttle and you keep going because you really don't have a choice, because this one's going to be really, really hard. And so what you start to learn is, when you have those cycles of things that go right and things that go wrong, you start to pick up, okay, this is going to be a cycle where things are going to go wrong, and you tool up for it. And so I think that was always instilled in all of you. And then on the flip side, when you asked about, shaking hands with the umpire,
Mm-hmm.
um, you have to have, and I can go through the character story, because obviously there's a story behind the character that um,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to also enjoy the good times. And so at the end of the game, when you shake the umpire's hand, which obviously is character, you're going to act the same way, win or lose, because people are going to remember your character. They're going to remember your reputation. In that particular situation, your sports programs. In fact, the state championship softball program that you remember, they just took second again, and that's
Mm-hmm.
even after the head coach and I, because the head coach of that program, he and I, we spent 10 years working
Yeah.
on the high school baseball. We all had daughters together, and then we were doing high school baseball, and we were doing you when you guys were like 6 years old, and
Yeah.
and the baseball players were coming out and helping out. And then at some point there was the natural transition where all of a sudden now we were coaching high school softball. And so, that character development was institutional just within our sports programs. But I think where it really locked in for me is, when obviously Anne had her cancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's that, if there's ever that hallmark moment in life, where you're going to be that family that, you watch on the
Yeah.
Christmas Story, where you have to go live in Seattle and your family separates, and all of a sudden, you're fighting cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler alert, right? Anne is on your podcast and she's
Yeah.
now a nurse today, so she lives, right? But when you're looking in the eyes of an 8-year-old, as a dad, and
Yeah.
you don't know where this thing is going to go, and you're thinking, okay, I've done search and rescue, I've given parents bad news, I've given parents good news, I know ICS, I know operations, I know how to put on the facade.
Yeah.
But now you're doing that for 4 months, waiting for a diagnosis. And then after the diagnosis, you're waiting another 6 months to see if this researcher out of, the University of Pittsburgh, whether his
Mm-hmm.
magic is going to work. And you're watching chemo go into your daughter's body for the first time, knowing that's going to have lifelong effects.
Yeah.
Um, that's a character tester.
Yeah.
And not only did our family go through that, you went through that, but because we were so involved in a small community, you and I, we all had eyes on us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to put on a front and a facade oftentimes, where
Yeah.
as a seventh grader, which you would have been 12 and 13, uh, now the good thing is you got a phone out of the deal, right?
Yeah. I did end up with a cell phone. I don't know
Yeah,
how
you,
that
you,
happened, but
you got that thing I said you were never going to get. That's literally because sometimes you would get a text message that say, "Hey, I had to leave town. Teacher A is taking you home with them," right? And so a good team, good network. We know that all worked out. But what the character that you're referencing that came out of that experience was the whole idea of, character, as in care, as in CCAIRR, right? You
yeah.
know that acronym stands for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Confidence, right?
Consider.
And
Yep.
so confident, considerate, adaptable, intentional, responsible, and resilient.
Yeah.
So and then we started using that system to debrief, sports after a game. We didn't talk about who won or
Mhm.
lost. We talked about character.
Yeah.
And then when we got back to practice the next day, then we would break down the nature of the game. But everything was about character. And so watching those kids, not just Anne, but roommates that some made it, some didn't,
Yeah.
they all had to be confident, right? They had to be considerate, adaptable, intentional, responsible, resilient. And the kids would earn different badges. They were really beads that went on a necklace. And then eventually you got your Purple Heart when you beat cancer. But these kids were like doing, they were drilling into their bone marrow and
Yeah.
injecting, fluids, chemo into their spinal columns. And they would get these little beads for having these procedures that, you know, technically would kill them if they didn't pump them with drugs to keep them alive. I mean,
Hmm.
what an amazing experience to watch. Today, Anne will and is probably going to be one of the best nurses. And she's already proven that, in the work that she's
Yeah.
doing, because she has bedside manners that people don't understand. And when she kind of explains, well, yeah, I kind of had this childhood thing,
Yeah.
it's really clear where that came from.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you touched on the beads. Well, you touched on the acronym character, because then to just add a little bit more to that story, you said at the end of every softball game we'd sit down and talk about character, and what we did, we had a necklace, just like a chain necklace, and we would point out one of those attributes. Again, I'll say I'm confident, considerate, adaptable, intentional, responsible, and resilient. So we'd point out one of those characteristics in one of our teammates and just highlight how at some point in the game they exemplified one of those traits. And so those are the words, like I use those words for everything, and they still, like, I will never, you almost seemed like you thought I forgot them. Like I will never forget those words, because that's how I live my life today. And when it comes to Anne's cancer, I think about, I mean, all of those words, but specifically resiliency, because for our family, for by and large our community, because one thing that you do in teaching and coaching and parenting is you bring real life into softball. You bring real life into the classroom. You bring real life, big real life, into our dining room table when we're eating dinner. And you do it in a way that's digestible and age appropriate, like you were talking about. And so you don't shy away from scary big things like cancer or politics or anything like that. You just simplify it. But anyway, going back to the resiliency piece, cancer built resiliency for all of us. And one of the quotes that came out of that experience was live every day. That's, I mean, how do you not have a new realization that you should live every day when not every day is guaranteed? And so will you just talk about live every day for a minute, and like when did it set in that, like, okay, like I know the whole experience was scary, I'm sure, but when did the live every day mantra appear?
So very clear. I mean, I can tell you exactly when that happened. So when her swollen eye turned into, a swollen cheek, that the lymphoma was in her sinuses. It took 4 months to diagnose, right? And then, I don't even know that I ever told her. It's like, okay, you're stage 4. You're lighting up like a Christmas tree when you're doing a
Hmm.
CT scan. Yeah. And
I didn't
so,
know it was stage 4.
oh, it was bad. And so I have those slides and I have those pictures, right?
Wow.
But obviously that's not something you're bringing up. And
Hmm.
so for us, we're trying to watch this scenario. I know Anne will listen to this podcast and she'll probably learn something new herself. But
Yeah.
um, it was Thanksgiving. We were down in the basement of the hospital, and we were building the the Thanksgiving turkey that you make with your hand, and then you put the colored feathers on it.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at it, right, because I could still cry just even telling these stories, 15 years later, 8, 14, 12, 13 years later. And so I could just really go back to that moment where, okay, look, we don't have a diagnosis. We're making turkeys. Um, what I can control is I can control the time with her right now. And literally, Mom and I made a bucket list, and there was a number of people that stepped up. I don't even think they knew what was behind my drive, but that's where, we went to a softball game, and then all of a sudden, you had university softball athletes that were reaching out, and they were connecting with Ann, and we were going to do. We were, whether it was the zoo, whether it was a softball game, whether it was her Make-A-Wish, where, she ended up in Hawaii, we were going to live every day because it literally may be the last. Now, obviously, it's a better story because she was healed and everybody was on our side this particular time around. But I don't think that's ever turned off.
Yeah.
And so I still have that drive. I'm not sure if I should, you know, tone it down a little bit. I mean, I'm getting old, and these 12 and
Yeah.
15-hour work
Yeah.
days are kind of getting long.
Yeah.
But I just, I can't stop,
Yeah.
keeping the real perspective of it all.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing that it was stage 4 because I don't know that I've ever even thought to ask. Like, I mean, again, I was 13. My brain was there, but elsewhere, like I didn't know what questions to ask at the time. But it's interesting hearing you say that because I wouldn't have thought it was that because the mindset the entire time was, we're going to beat this. It was, we're going to beat this and we're going to live every day. And there was no doubt in my mind that even if things weren't okay, that we were going to be okay. And so, yes, it was a scary time, but I don't really like mark that time in my life as like fear. I don't think I ever felt fear. And that's just a large testament to you and Mom. And again, another thing Ann and I were talking about that you say a lot is to just control what you can control. You can't control whether cancer takes the life of your daughter, but you can control, like you're saying, how you're shaping those moments of building turkeys or riding our bikes through the hall in the hospital or going and like I don't know. I could go on and on about the many things that we have been able to control and have been great experiences because we chose not to be victims of it. I, another time I brought up or another time you brought up control what you can control numerous times for me was when I called you at like probably 1 a.m. East Coast time, which isn't as late your time, but still you answered regardless of what time I called. This morning I literally called, I'm just telling our audience, this morning I literally called my dad. I didn't end up needing his help because I figured it out before he answered, but I literally pushed his name because I locked my keys in the car this morning and my dad is the first person I call because he's always there. But anyway, control what you can control came up in college so many times when I was 1 a.m. My to-do list is so long. I'm trying to figure out how to triage. And the first thing you say is control what you can control and map out the rest of your day, just hour by hour, what you're going to do and just get through it one day at a time. Live every moment, live every day. So all those things just tie together. So thanks for sharing on that. Is there anything else from the cancer era, I'll call it, that has really stuck with you and impacted the way that you live today?
Well, I think something that was unique about that too, and the head coach of the high school program, if you remember, the rest of that story was he actually came to me because that's when we were putting the high school program together. He and I were taking over, and so we literally had a family conversation. It was a crossroads, right? Okay, our youngest daughter's fighting cancer, but you're being asked to go back into coaching
Yeah.
and build a high school state championship program. In our family, we chose, yeah,
Hmm.
because again, it was part of that live every day. And
Yeah.
so, Mom and my thinking was, you're going to be tracking with me. You're already living out of a bag in the classroom. You're already playing softball yourself. And now you're literally living with your dad on the road. Because in our unique area, away games mean, a
Yeah.
2.5 hour drive any place you're going to go. So your away games half the season were on the road. But we would meet up with Mom because she would sneak her out of the hospital because as long as
Hmm.
she was an hour away, so she would come down and our family approach was it's either going to make us or break us, and I think it made us stronger. So again, we usually when we get faced with hardship, we get doubled down. But you were talking about these experiences making you stronger and tougher. Well, I'm pretty sure that you work in a pretty advanced dispatch center right now where the public is in distress and they're now calling you and you're supposed to now be solving problems for people. And so all those experience for you, I think, has laid a foundation where you have a lot of experience to draw from, I think, in your professional career right now.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And sometimes I think I forget that. I I go about my day and do the things I need to do, but then I like having conversations like this often because it grounds you and makes you reflect on the foundation that I do have, and it builds my confidence. Another one of the buzzwords there. That builds my confidence for sure. And one thing, just going off, kind of transitioning from the cancer, but still around the cancer. One thing out of numerous things that transpired after that time was the firefighter stair climb. And so, just to give some background, every year the Lymphoma and Leukemia Society puts on a firefighter stair climb in the tallest building in Seattle. So all the firefighters in their full gear climb the stairs and raise money for cancer. And so one thing that you did with our community is you started bringing all the sports teams. That started probably softball and then swim team, and then all the teams like are climbing the community stairs with the firefighters as they train for that event, and we're raising money in the local the streets of our city. And so even though your daughter's the one who's facing cancer, you're still teaching and pouring in to the community around you. So I just personally want to know where your drive for service came from, like growing up, and so where it came from, one, and then how did you instill that in us, and what motivates you to continue pouring into your community today? Even though you got so many things going on for yourself, you're still out there serving others. So where did that come from, and how do you do it?
Yeah. I don't think I have really any profound answer other than I think growing up in a small community, my dad was service oriented. He, as a simple mill worker, right, a mechanic in a mill, in a plywood mill, in a small timber community, he was still involved in a lot of community aspects. So, he was involved in the county fair, so he was involved with things on that side. So I always saw that, and then obviously the career path of teaching and
Mm-hmm.
coaching. That's I had many good mentors that influenced me. Some of those are still around today. They're still my close friends. Uh, I would say that maybe there's been a generational shift, but that was part of the expectation when you were hired
Mm-hmm.
as a teacher. It was expected that you would do a second career on top of your teaching and also coach or
Yeah.
take on another activity. I don't know that that expectation is necessarily in place today. Whereas you and Anne were taught that, and because you were influenced by many of those same people that were
Mm-hmm.
influencing me, right? We could go through that list of names, and we would have
Yeah.
the same characters that we would list off here. And so I think small communities have something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And in small communities, you get things done because you don't have a
Mm-hmm.
choice. You can't rely on something oftentimes outside,
Yeah.
going to come in and solve your problems for you. You have to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's makes sense, and I think that sometimes it's funny because going through hard times teaches you to work. And when I'm not going through hard times, sometimes it's really, really tempting to just sit and prioritize my own comfort. And that's another reason that I'm thankful for parenting, because it takes you out of your own little world, and it forces you to prioritize things other than your comfort. And that's something I don't know. I don't know if it's a generational thing. I don't know if it's. I mean, I feel like it has to partly be because of technology, because technology, by and large, it puts us sitting on our butts instead of out, even just working in the yard or talking to a neighbor. And so I have to continue to push myself to be others focused and for you and mom, I'm just always so amazed how you talked about the pace that you live. You guys live a very fast-paced life, but it's never about you. And I get exhausted watching you, but somehow it just keeps going because you're other centric and you just get the job done. So I am just very inspired by you every day, even when I am not physically with you. I think about you a lot and know that you're up at the property mowing or doing other things, and you got a lot going on. But again, you're always my first call. And maybe Nolan should be my first call, honestly, because I need to transition at some point. But you're always my first call when I need something, whether it be physical, like I'm locked out of my car, or emotional, like I am overwhelmed and don't know what to do. You help me break it down in a way that's manageable. So thank you for that. What is kind of talking about young people and advice that you have? What is a piece of advice that you would give to young people today about staying true to their values and being involved in their communities? Today, with social media, there's so many things influencing us, and I call it toxic empathy. It's what Allie B. Stuckey calls it actually in her book. But there's so many different things coming at you that people are saying are right. And it's really easy to get swayed one way or another, whether it be politically or just in our character. So what advice would you have about staying true to our values?
Well, I guess, if you're looking for a formula, as a young person to maybe, as a
Hmm.
foundation, we always broke it down into the three-legged stool, right? I mean, there's a one-legged stool is going to be wobbly, a two-legged stool is going to be wobbly. By the time you get to three legs, you can get four and five, but there's three main anchors of that three-legged stool, right? You need your academics and your education. You need your athletics
Hmm.
or your music. It's some kind of a performance. I
Hmm.
think the 4-H kids often have that. The dance
Yeah.
kids have that. That experience where you've got a team, you're going to be on a stage, people are going to know whether you practice because your performance isn't going to lie, right?
Hmm.
Your academics is messy because you're going to learn, but you also you're going to be evaluated with grades. And then that third component, and that's where that community service comes in, right? Early on
Hmm.
when you're younger, you're going to have community service, you're going to have volunteerism, but eventually that's going to be a job where you've got to make a commitment.
Yeah.
You're going to get compensated for it because you have to. I mean, our economic system is based on having funds to buy things and pay costs. But you need those three components, and you need to continue to nurture those. They're going to evolve and change. But even, as a young person, you can have a chore, even if it's just, feeding the dog, right? And if
Hmm.
that's a simple thing, or maybe it's taking your plate to the sink and rinsing it off. And I think people that have that and they're introduced to those three different areas as they grow older, those routines become, I would say, a little bit more ingrained. And then if you start teaching exactly what it is that we're doing, right? Like we're talking right now, so I don't know all of who your audience is. I think that you've got a number of kids that are still looking up to you. You have friends and family that are watching this. I know it's continuing to expand as you've continued to build your message, but that's kind of a formula. It's
Hmm.
the resume, right? I mean, the old school resume. Are you a well balanced individual? But at the same time, where you just referenced that, we were probably over excessive on that,
Hmm.
because of our professions, right? I mean, it's a giving profession where
Hmm.
you're teaching and you're coaching. That's your job. But more importantly, back to you, what you picked up on it is you usually don't see, the complaining side. I complain in my own way, and that's, I guess, what excavators and playing in the dirt are for, or chainsaws, right? You can kind of get away from it, and then you can complain to the trees, right? Um, but but in the adult world, right? When your 1.5-year old looks at you, you're everything in the world. You're going to
Hmm.
solve those problems.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that having kids really teaches you how to be an adult. And so back to your very first question, who am I? I'm still trying to figure out how to be a good dad. And now I've got, students, or parents because I'm getting old enough now that I'm kind of starting to get, older than my most of my parents.
Hmm.
They're trying to figure out. Sometimes they look to people for advice, and that's just doctors have always had that role.
Yeah.
When I grew up, doctors worked 24 hours a day, and they were always there, and they were going to have answers for you. I'm not even going to remotely compare a teacher to a doctor, but a doctor is another example of a service role. Or when the firefighter shows up,
Hmm.
you expected they're going to solve the problem, or the police officer, or the military, right?
Yeah.
And that's I would say that is the historical American that we've always known. I believe in our history. I believe in that persona of that rugged individualism.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as far as like navigating and deciphering what the definition of right even is, can you give another formula that you use with your students? I don't know that I know it exactly, but the propaganda truth, can you give that formula too and explain that one?
Yeah. So I think there's two things, right? A, our Constitution is based on, right, Christianity and the Bible and the commandments, right? There's
Hmm.
Our system doesn't work if crime or abuse of other people. I mean, there's things, and again, for me, I can't come out and say the Commandments and teach the Ten Commandments and say, "Thou shalt not." I have to reference it in more of a moral character perspective, and so. I think that's one of your formulas. It's really simple, right? I mean, it's been
Hmm.
around for thousands of years. And then, as far as trying to interpret like the world, because there is so much media influence. I mean, I think AI now officially has surpassed
Yeah.
human contribution to the internet. I think AI and algorithms are now creating more data than humans are. Um, the formula is fact minus propaganda minus censorship equals the truth. And so
Hmm.
if you're trying to get to the truth, you've got to dig into the facts. And, there's not a lot of money made if you slow down and present people with facts. It's the
Hmm.
propaganda and the censorship that, gets scrolls and clicks and eyeballs.
Hmm.
That has to be
Hmm.
taught. Again, it's more
Yeah.
important now than ever it ever has been. It's always been there.
Yeah. As Christians, we're called to live out our faith in every area of our life. You as a teacher and me as a military officer, we can't necessarily do that outwardly and straight up front. We can't proselytize. Um, but how do you see the Bible guiding us in our role as citizens, especially in today's world?
Yeah, and I think, being more of an introvert type of a person, you didn't really see my faith showing up. I'm not I don't, quote proverbs. I don't do my prayers out loud. I usually do a lot of that stuff in private, which, now that I'm older, I reflect back, you didn't see that part of it. And
Hmm.
so there's probably a better way to do that, so if I had to do that all over again, I'd probably modify that way. But fortunately, you picked up on OCF, created a strong network, and you got tied into that. So there were some people in your life that were influential, and I have a lot of appreciation for them. And so, uh, and then also, that ties back into my, and your job. It's
Hmm.
not something that we can outwardly show. But the funny thing is people know.
Yeah.
When you have a solid foundation in faith, whether you're fighting cancer, whether you're going into a state championship softball game, whether you're talking to a parent who is dealing with something with their student, and you're writing emails and figuring out, these are for public record, but yet I know that a student in need is going to probably end up reading this because I'm writing it to the parent. So you start to use you choose your words very, very wisely. You don't use words that you can't take back. It takes years to build relationships. It can take seconds to destroy them.
Hmm.
So you just become more mature in your tone and your demeanor. But I also think that you're trained in that. For me, with search and rescue, and literally getting phone calls in the middle of the night where for a local agency, these are the agencies that a lot of times are, in concert with the Coast Guard
Yeah.
agencies. like, I would work with them. I would call them in. I'd be on the ground side of it. Um, and that's what showmanship is, right? Fake
Mhm.
it till you make it, right? That's what
Yeah.
being an officer is all about. But, 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 but in your heart, right? You've got to have faith. You've got to know that there's somebody up there that's watching over you.
Hmm.
In many situations, you're wondering, you're going to go home at night. That's kind of the cliche emergency services, commitment is we will go home at night. But at some point, you're putting yourself out there. And so that side, in that former life when I was younger, and doing that kind of work, it clearly shaped who I am as an adult today.
Hmm.
And most people don't have that experience, Erin. I think maybe
Hmm.
you take that for granted in your military work. You can sit here
Hmm.
and look like a mom in a podcast with a beautiful background, but they don't see you on the side of a ship at midnight,
Yeah.
climbing up into who knows what. They don't see that side of you, right?
Yeah.
And you don't flaunt that side of you because that's not what you do.
Hmm.
Uh, but once you get on deck and all of a sudden you're faced with whatever scenario you're going to see, it's your job to be in control. And especially
Yeah.
as a female, I know you've got a team of people that are in those situations,
Hmm.
but that's where you start to rely on team.
Yeah.
And in the civilian world, not everybody necessarily gets exposed to that. And at the same
Hmm.
time, um, you're also in front of firefighters, senior officers. At points you're going to be close to, you shook hands with a vice president. So
Yeah.
that's all. I'm not going to say showmanship, but it's character.
Hmm.
But that faith that regardless of who all of those players are,
Yeah.
there's somebody bigger watching you.
Hmm.
And with youth today, because we don't get to talk about that because separation of church and state, or because we've interpreted it that way. I've gone back and I've
Yeah.
read a lot of the case law to really find out what I can or can't say. And I'm
Mm.
not in the classroom pushing religion at all. But at some point, kids start to, and most importantly, the Christian kids start to recognize, wow, this guy has a Christian background.
Yeah.
And it's probably time for us to maybe reverse that trend. I don't campaign for people to become Christians or become religious. What I campaign for is to understand the moral foundation and the moral compass that gives you character. And then if you take that step and you know that somebody above is looking over you, it gives you a lot more confidence. That's what faith is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good, and there's a lot there. And I, one of my mentors at some point had told me the quote, like share the gospel and when necessary use words, which just means that your life should speak it. And there's times obviously when you want to be able to explain your faith and have those deeper conversations, but I have decided that I want my faith to impact every decision I make, every interaction I have, and even if I'm not talking about Jesus at work in the command center, like I'm still I'm not swearing, I'm not watching the bad movies that the rest of them are watching. I am choosing to simply care about people. There's just differences that I wish weren't so out of the norm, but there are so many differences when we remain grounded in our faith. Um, Two more questions for you. When it comes to the future of our country, what do you think it holds? What do you think the future holds for America, and how can we as citizens stay focused on our mission to support the nation's growth and overall well-being?
Well, I think you just answered that
Yeah.
because at some point you were saying use your voice, right? And so here, let me test you, right? Let me give your audience an example of what yeah, that look. I recognize that look. I got pictures of that look. Um, so what's the First Amendment, right? Freedom of
Hmm.
speech,
Yeah.
freedom of the press, right?
Yeah.
And when our country built our Constitution, which, right, in God we trust, right? There's a reason that those quotes are in there. What you're going to recognize is that the first thing that had to happen was they had to build a um, Bill of Rights, because in history, government is going to become powerful unless the people control it, right? And
Hmm.
so when they built the Bill of Rights, you have your 10 amendments. Well, what was the very first one that they promoted? You got to have your
Hmm.
voice.
Hmm.
And so look at what you're doing now. You are now getting involved and using your voice. You had to walk a really fine line as you've transitioned from doing stuff with the Coast Guard during COVID. Now you're doing stuff on your own. You're separating that. You're not necessarily promoting the Coast Guard. Obviously, that's your career, and
Hmm.
some of your followers know that. But you're finding out in 2025 where corporate media is kind of
Yeah.
evolving, and now you have everybody with the ability to do a podcast
Hmm.
but really what it is, the technology is changing.
Hmm.
It could have been the town square when you were, reading the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence, and you were screaming from, your soapbox, right? Now you're using your voice in a podcast, and you're trying to
Hmm.
figure this out in your purpose. And I've asked you this numerous times. What's your purpose? And you're wanting to reach down. You're not wanting to give handouts. You're wanting to give these kids a hand up. If they want to go in the Coast Guard Academy,
Hmm.
I'm a few years out. I'm starting to lose touch with it, but this is what I've learned. And
Hmm.
now you're talking to moms, right? You've had moms that have reached out to you.
Hmm.
So you've learned how to do that, and
Hmm.
that's like the number one. Not only in a 250-year-old. I mean, did you know that the United States is one of two countries that was designed on paper? I mean,
Hmm.
every country in the world happened over time, or evolved, or it was conquered, right? The United States and Canada are the only two countries that were literally drafted on a piece of paper, voted
Hmm.
on, and approved. So there is a rule book for this.
Yeah.
And in order to protect that,
Yeah.
people's voices in that document said this has to be a priority.
Yeah.
So you're practicing something that is, over 250 years old in this
Hmm.
country.
Hmm. Hmm. And then finally, last question for you. After all of these years of teaching, serving, what is the legacy that you hope to leave behind in terms of guiding people to mind their mission as citizens? And what is one key lesson that you want people to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I guess as a final thought, I don't know how to make this, sound profound. But I'll use this example for you. You talked about the stair climb challenge earlier, which is the Columbia Center in Seattle,
Mhm.
and that's always been this, the home screen for my phone
Yeah.
for years, right? For
Hmm.
a number of years, and I've often seen people put pictures of their kids and their grandkids as their screensavers, and I've always kind of made fun of that. Well,
Yeah.
you sent me a photo of your son not too long ago, and my dad was always standing at the outfield fence. So whether I was playing baseball, whether I was coaching baseball, I could always look up and I knew my dad was going to be there. Well, when he passed, it was right in that same window where Weston was coming down, and I always say that
Yeah.
they high fived on the way by. So
Yeah.
as as I became, that guy, right, that grandpa that stuck Weston's picture on my screensaver, it's more than just a picture of my grandson because,
Yeah.
your first question of me, who am I? I'm still defining my role as a dad, but now I'm recognizing, okay, what's my role as a grandfather going to be? So you're always
Yeah.
kind of staging and reflecting on how others are going to see you. And so, even the work that I'm doing here on the property, there's going to be grandchildren that hopefully use this property someday. So am I building things into this work that they can appreciate,
Yeah.
5, 10, 20 years from now, or more importantly, when they turn 55, can they keep this flow going, or will it be time to do something different? Which, hopefully they have the skills and knowledge to not hopefully, it's our job to prepare them to make those kind of decisions.
Yeah.
So, whether you're, 16 years old watching this, thinking about going into the Coast Guard Academy, whether you're 25 years old thinking about whether you should have kids, whether you're adults who are watching you, family members that are hearing obviously a lot about, my perspective on things.
Mhm.
I think that there's a team aspect to it,
Yeah.
and you have to figure out where you are.
Mhm.
You have to be comfortable where you are. You have to have faith that what you're doing is the right thing. Sometimes it's going to be murky.
Hmm.
As I say, sometimes when you're stuck in the mud, sometimes you like need to stop because
Hmm.
you don't need to dig the hole deeper. Sometimes you need to step on the gas because you don't have a choice. You need to get through that mud bog in your life, right? You're getting
Hmm.
bogged down. Sometimes you're going to need help. You're going to need to reach out. And all the things that you do in life, especially the things that go wrong, right? Start embracing those.
Yeah.
I don't think any time that you called me from the academy, because of course you always called me when things are going wrong, because that's what kids do, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I never told you in those moments about all the things that you did right. I never talked about your trophies or your ribbons or your championships. It was always, okay, so you're facing this challenge. Well, remember when this happened to you. And usually
Yeah.
about halfway through the story, you hung up and you were gone, and I didn't hear from you for another 2 weeks because apparently you got the message and it solved the problem. But but more importantly, especially where you are now,
Yeah.
you're now starting to think about that as a parent.
Hmm.
You've benefited from that, but now you're starting to think, okay, how do I provide that to the younger kids below me, or the younger
Yeah.
cadets, or the younger ensigns? Um, and that's what being adult is, and that's what's so beautiful about our country is we promote that. In our country,
Yeah.
we promote that. We just, you reference politics a little bit. There's some things we need to clean up. We've gone through some bumpy times, but if you don't go through bumpy times, then you can't get to the good times again. There's some natural cycles, I think, that take place there.
Yeah. Yeah. That I think the reflection piece that you're talking about, like, yes, I do this podcast because I want to help other people, but a great byproduct has just been that I'm able to reflect, and it puts a time on my calendar that's dedicated towards having conversations that force me to think about my own life, think about whoever I'm talking with, their life, and how our experiences and the lessons that we've learned throughout our own stories will impact my decisions going forward. So thanks, Dad, for coming on today, for sharing a lot of wisdom that I had heard before, but also some nuggets that I hadn't heard before, that I'm going to take from here and reflect on even even more. And I know that you are busy wrapping up school. You're also your youngest daughter's getting married. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, she her fiance, since the first time I ever watched him watch her, absolutely loves her. And so I have not only benefited from two wonderful daughters, but I'm going to have two great son-in-laws too. So that's pretty cool. You guys have made some really good choices.
And you'll have to we'll have to take a lot more pictures because you got more grandchildren coming. So we'll have them all standing at the fence for a picture for your home screen.
All right. Hey, I love you. I'm proud of you, and keep up the hard work.
I love you too, Dad. Thanks for hopping on, and thanks for everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.